Two former NBA players just announced that they're entering the WNBA draft. And they're not doing it because they think they're women. They're doing it to prove a point. Enes Kanter and Royce White are forcing the WNBA to answer one very simple question. What makes someone eligible to compete as a woman? And here's the problem. If your answer is based on identity, where exactly is the line? What's going on, everybody? I'm Joe England, aka the Stoic Viking. Now, obviously, this is a bit of a stunt, but the argument is essentially something called reductio ad absurdum, which is Latin for reduction to absurdity. It's a legitimate form of a logical argument where you can take a claim or a principle and follow its logic to its conclusion, and to show that it produces an absurd, impossible, or contradictory result. And that's essentially what Kanter and White are trying to do here. They are saying, okay, if gender identity rather than biological sex determine who qualifies as a woman in sports, let's follow that principle all the way to its logical conclusion. And they're using themselves as the extreme example. And that's why sometimes an absurd example is the fastest way to expose what you believe is an absurdity in the rules. And that's what makes this interesting to me, because I've spent most of my life in environments where standards matter. You meet the standards or you don't. The standard doesn't change because it's uncomfortable, and it definitely doesn't change because we've changed the language around it. Sports operate the same way. Height, weight, strength, speed, biology, they all matter. In fact, the entire reason women's sport exists in the first place is because we recognize that biological differences matter enough to create its own protective, competitive category. So if that's true, there's a question for the NBA and really every sporting organization that they have to be able to answer. What defines that category? That's the argument Kanter and White are forcing into the open. And today we're going to follow that argument wherever the facts take us. Now, before we get into the argument, understand that neither Enes Kanter nor Royce White suddenly became political because of this single issue. Kanter has been an outspoken political activist for years. He became famous for opposing, and I'm probably going to butcher this, the Turkish president Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and later he became an outspoken critic of the Chinese Communist Party over Tibet, Hong Kong, and the treatment of the Uyghurs. Also probably butchering that as well. When he became an American citizen in 2021, he literally changed his name to Enes Kanter. Royce White came from a different direction. He initially became known for advocating for mental health issues with professional sports and eventually entered politics himself, becoming the Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate in Minnesota in 2024. And I believe he's running again in 2026. So these two aren't random former NBA players. These are two men with histories of their using their platforms to make political arguments. And now they've chosen women's sports. Strength isn't built in comfort. It's built through repetition, through discipline, through showing up when it would be easier not to. For me, training has always been about pushing limits, becoming stronger, faster, and more capable every single day. But the gear you wear matters. Barbell Apparel was built for athletes who move, who train, who refuse to compromise between performance and style. Clothes that move with you, built for strength, built for durability, and built for the grind. Whether it's the gym, the track, or the everyday mission, train hard, move freely, live disciplined. Barbell Apparel. Use code STOICViking25 and step into the gear that's built for you, how you actually train. So let's be clear. This is political theater. They're intentionally using an extreme example to stress test this principle. If gender identity determines eligibility for women's sports, they're asking, what exactly is the boundary? Is identifying as a woman enough? Is hormone treatment enough? For how long? Does testosterone determine eligibility? Does having gone through male puberty matter? If you look at former NBA player and immediately say, obviously he shouldn't be playing in the WNBA, okay, but why? Your answer probably tells us where you think the boundary probably should be. Now, saying anyone can simply identify as a woman today and immediately compete in every women's sport would be a straw man. Well, many organizations have specific eligibility requirements, but that brings us to the fundamental question. Why do women's sports exist in the first place? Why do we have an NBA and a WNBA? Why do we have a men's and a women's World Cup? Men and women's Olympic track, swimming, rugby, and weightlifting. Why are we separating all these events? Because biological sex affects athletic performance, particularly after puberty. Women's sports exist as a protective and competitive category, and soccer, gives us an incredible illustration. And, I'm using this example because, for a lot of you guys may not know, I am a career soccer player. Grew up in Germany playing soccer, went to college on a scholarship. So this hits really close for me. And I constantly hear that the U.S. women's national team is better than the U.S. men's national team. And if you mean more intentionally accomplished, absolutely. The women have won multiple World Cups and Olympic gold medals, but head to head is something completely different. In 2017, the U.S. women's national team played the FC Dallas U15 boys, which is boys of age 14 or younger. The boys won 5-2. The Australian women's national team played a Newcastle Jets boys youth side, also a U15 team, in 2016. They lost 7-0. And even Switzerland women's national team played FC Luzern's U15 boys in 2025. They lost to the boys 7-1. We're talking about some of the world's best adult female soccer players playing adolescent boys. How can that happen? Well, male puberty matters. It produces substantial average differences in things like strength, speed, power, muscle mass, and aerobic capacity. That's not an insult to female athletes. It's why the female category exists in the first place. And major sporting organizations, especially in the last couple of years, have increasingly been confronted with this very issue. I'm going to name off a number of organizations, and I'll keep this brief because their policies aren't identical, and I'll try to describe which ones are slightly differently. Most people are one decision away from changing everything. I spent years at the tip of the spear as a Tier 1 operator, and the one thing that separated the men who made it from the ones who didn't had nothing to do with talent. It was fitness, and not just physical fitness. The discipline, the clarity, the mental edge that comes from being locked in physically. And that transfers to every single area of your life. For a limited time, I'm offering a 30-minute one-on-one fitness consultation and audit. We will get on a call and I'll break down exactly what you need to be doing going forward. And not a cookie cutter program, but a custom strategy built for you that you can implement immediately. 30 minutes, $49.99. And you will walk away with a plan from someone who has operated and lived this at the highest levels. If you are serious about leveling up, click the link. For example, the NCAA women's competition is restricted to athletes assigned to female at birth. The World Athletics, it's an elite female category that uses biological eligibility criteria, including the SRY gene testing. World Aquatics, it's a rules focused heavily on whether an athlete experienced male puberty beyond its eligibility threshold. The UCI International Cycling restricts transgender women who transitioned after male puberty from its women category. World Rugby, its policy emphasizes both fairness and safety because physiological differences matter enormously in a collision sport and as physical as rugby. World Boxing, it has adopted sex-based eligibility standards involving genetic testing. Women's professional tennis, the WTA has also moved towards biological eligibility requirements. And even the Olympics, the IOC, has moved towards clearer biological sex eligibility standards for the female category. Different organizations, different sports, different policies, but the same underlying recognition. And it seems most of the organizations in sports throughout the world have made a decision on what exactly is the eligibility criteria. There's a few left, and one of them is the WNBA. So what is the WNBA's definition? Now, here's where we're going to need some nuance. Hormone treatment does affect athletic performance. Testosterone suppression can reduce muscle mass, strength, and power. That's real. But losing some of that advantage is not the same as erasing it completely. Hormone treatment doesn't erase all the physiological effects and potential athletic advantages created by going through male puberty. Male puberty changes the body. It affects muscle development, skeletal dimensions, height, limb length, cardiovascular characteristics, and numerous other traits relevant to athletic performance. Some characteristics change through hormone treatment. Others do not simply reverse. If you're 6'5" because you went through male puberty, lowering testosterone doesn't make you 5'9". Your arms don't suddenly get shorter. Your skeleton doesn't reset. And basketball is a sport where height, reach, strength, power, and body dimensions matter enormously. So the relevant question isn't simply, did this athlete lower their testosterone? It's, did transition remove enough of the physiological effects and athletic advantages of male puberty to make competition in the female category fair? That's the question that all these governing bodies have to answer. And this concept isn't unique to women's sports. Sports create categories around physical differences constantly. Look at boxing. I spent years as a Tier 1 operator with ISA, and I had the privilege to work with some of the best conditioned human beings on the planet. I know what peak performance looks like, and I also know what it looks like when someone's running on empty and they're telling themselves that it's just stress. If you're watching this and your energy is down, your recovery is shot, and you feel like you're operating at half capacity, your testosterone is probably the reason. I know it was for me, because it's not your mindset, it's not your discipline, it's your biology. Human performance is veteran-owned and operated by other Tier 1 operators. They run blood work, they will build a protocol around you, and they actually know what they're doing because they've lived the same life as you. And I use them because I don't promote things I don't use. Because you're watching right now, you can get a discount of 20% off by using my discount code Viking. The link is below. Get the blood work done. If you're fine, then you'll know. If not, then you'll have a solution. Either way, you win. Discount code Viking. Do it today. Imagine Floyd Mayweather fighting a prime Mike Tyson, both men, both incredible boxers, both world championships. But nobody says they're both men, so put them in the ring. We have weight classes because physical differences matter. And that's not just about fairness, it's also about safety. That's men versus other men, but yet we also separate athletes by age. We have Paralympic classifications, and we separate sports by biological sex. The principle is simple. When a physical characteristic creates a large enough competitive difference, sports create categories to account for it. So saying transgender athletes shouldn't compete in the female category doesn't necessarily mean they're saying they shouldn't compete at all. There could be an open division or potentially a transgender category where participation numbers make that viable. Maybe different sports require different solutions, but difficulty creating another category doesn't mean you eliminate the purpose of the existing female category. You can believe transgender athletes deserve opportunities to compete while simultaneously believing biological females deserve a protected competitive category. Those ideas aren't contradictory. And this is where women's sports become part of something much larger. During the so-called woke era, America and much of the Western world became embroiled in an argument over biological sex and gender identity. And eventually we reached the bizarre point where defining the word woman itself became politically controversial. Biological sex and gender identity are different concepts, and there are many situations where someone's biological sex may have almost nothing to do with their ability to participate. But sports are different. The human body is a part of the competition. Eventually, someone has to step onto the court, get into the ring, stand on the starting blocks, and somebody has to determine which category that athletes qualify for. That's where the abstract ideology runs directly into physical reality. And I think we reached a point where even acknowledging those distinctions became controversial. And for example, during Jackson's Supreme Court confirmation hearing, she was asked to define what a woman is and declined, saying, "I'm not a biologist."
Can you provide a definition for the word woman?
Can I provide a definition? No.
Yeah.
I can't. Not in this context.
So
I'm not a biologist.
That moment became culturally significant because it represented something bigger. We had become afraid of definitions, but sports can't operate without definitions. So why did this go unchallenged for as long as it did? I think many people were simply afraid to speak. They didn't want to be called hateful or transphobic. They didn't want to jeopardize careers, sponsorships, or reputations. Eventually, female athletes started speaking publicly. One of the most prominent was Riley Gaines. Gaines competed against Leah Thomas in 2022. Thomas had previously competed on Penn's men's swimming team before transitioning. And look at the rankings. In the 200-yard freestyle, Thomas went from being ranked 554th among men to 5th among women. And in the 500-yard freestyle, Thomas went from 65th among men to number 1 amongst women, eventually winning the NCAA Women's National Championship. Gaines actually tied Thomas for 5th in that 200 freestyle. And that experience helped propel Gaines into becoming one of America's most prominent advocates for protecting the female category. And here's the larger lesson. Bad ideas don't always require everybody to believe them. Sometimes they just require enough reasonable people to remain silent. And eventually, somebody has to be willing to say, I think this is wrong. And here's why. And that's what brings us back to Enes Kanter Freedom and Royce White. You can think their stunt is ridiculous. You can disagree with their agreement, but they're willing to publicly put their names behind something that they believe in. And I respect that principle, even when somebody disagrees with me. Courage isn't agreeing with me. It's being willing to articulate what you believe, defend it rationally, and accept the consequences of saying it. Kanter and White are essentially telling the WNBA, define your category, explain the rule, explain the principle behind it, and defend it. Because that's ultimately what this entire controversy comes down to. Women's sports exist for a reason. We recognize biological differences in virtually every other area of athletic competition where those differences meaningfully affect fairness or safety. Weight classes, age divisions, disability classifications, sex categories, and recognizing biological reality doesn't require treating transgender people without dignity or respect. Those aren't mutually exclusive positions. You can support opportunities for transgender athletes while protecting women's sports. Maybe that's an open category. Maybe it's different sports find different solutions, but the female category has to mean something. And that's the question Kanter and White are forcing the WNBA to confront. What defines the women's category? And whatever you answer, be willing to defend it. Because a healthy society isn't one where everybody agrees. It's one where people aren't afraid to disagree. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments. Should women's sports be based strictly on biological sex? Should there be an open division, or is there another solution? Make your argument, challenge mine, but whatever you believe, don't be afraid to say it.